It's that time of year. The NBA season is wrapping up, and we are all talking about awards. Devin Booker getting into the conversation about his MVP odds, Mikal Bridges, Defensive Player of the Year. We'll see. Jackson Frank is here to break it all down. Coming up on this episode of Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a contributor at Suns.com, as well as Dime Magazine, and a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons. Thank you to everybody for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. We're on every single platform, including our YouTube channel, which is growing slowly but surely as we ramp up toward the playoffs. Should be fun there. We might be going live, having some fun when there's fewer games to keep up with. So go support there. Scroll down, hit subscribe. You know the drill. But today we have what's becoming an award show somehow. Wanted to talk about defense. Wanted to talk about Mikal Bridges. And Jackson Frank, our guest today, is a contributor over at Basketball News, among other places, where, Jackson, you participated in a piece really breaking down like modern defense, what defense means this year, and everything else. So we were going to start there, but then Devin Booker decided to upend our schedule, our programming, with a tweet about his own MVP candidacy, which players don't often necessarily comment on. So figured we could start there. But first, how are you doing? How are you enjoying the Sixers? This crazy experience. You are you are a Sixers follower for a long time. What's your gauge on this point in the NBA calendar? Are you ready for it to be done like I am?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we were talking a little bit, before we started recording. I think at any point in the year, it's fun to watch, but it's been strained maybe the last couple of weeks. Guys in and out of the lineups. Certain teams really lean into the youth development portion of their season, and so you get a lot of matchups.
That's okay.
You get a lot of matchups where it's a team that is the 4 seed versus the 14 seed, and the 14 seed's best player isn't in. So what do you take away from that game? So I've enjoyed it, but I've had enough of those opportunities watching throughout the year that I'm looking forward to 2 teams where their goal is to win, regardless of youth development, right? So. I don't have anything against the word taking, but I like to kind of phrase it as youth development, just because that's the positive spin on it, right? That's the way to go about it. So definitely looking forward to it. We got 3.5 weeks, I think, until the playoffs begin, but not necessarily, not going to complain about games where not everything is the highest stake. And I feel like I can have a little less maybe of every play has to be scrutinized as in depth. I don't
Sure.
mind that as much, but I'm good. I'm good. And the Sixers feels like kind of a roller coaster every game, even during the Harden era. So keeps me on my toes there for sure.
That's a great way to start this off. I mean, this season has been weird, just like last season was. There's been a little bit less in the way of prolonged COVID absences, but obviously that played a big role in players' availability this season and just our own sort of ability to digest basketball on and off the court and everything else. And then there's just this new sort of way that the regular season seems to work in the NBA, where players are more willing to rest and teams don't seem to embrace the regular season so much. And MVP candidates seem to be coming from every corner of the league, of the playoff race at the very least. So just to set the stage, Isaiah Thomas, not the one that just got signed to the Hornets, but the one who won a championship in the 80s, decided to say on Twitter, Devin Booker should be in the MVP conversation. Perfectly normal tweet type of thing that happens all the time. And then Booker quote tweeted it, said, "Appreciate that, IT, but the quote criteria changes depending on the player's name." And Jackson, I think about this from more of the perspective of the conversation around Devin Booker's All-Star candidacy, because I don't know how closely you tracked this, but did you realize this was the first season that Booker had made the All-Star team as a non-injury replacement, just an outright All-Star? It's his third team, but it's only his first one where he didn't have to be a replacement.
Yeah, I was aware of that, and I think I'd have to think back to the last couple of years, how off the cuff it felt like last year he probably deserved it outright. I don't recall 2 years ago when the Suns were kind of, I mean, not that it matters. Like, it wasn't Booker's fault, but the Suns obviously, weren't as good 2 years ago. Again, I don't ever want to conflate team success with individual prowess, but I thought last year he was probably deserving of a spot outright. And this year, obviously, he made it, but it was, it was cool for him to not have to sweat that out. I know it had been a point of contention among some Suns fans. Maybe he's talked about it a little bit as well. So it was nice that he got to just fly in smoothly to Cleveland without any hiccups, before or during the process.
So point being, as you just laid out, there was a case against. Where I understand what he's talking about here is, as obviously sort of like social media-ish as he's being, is I think it's actually a realistic kind of question to pose about, I mean, it's always something we talk about, right, with awards, and you were just getting at it there. It's like, to what degree should we factor in winning? How do we think about winning in the context of all the other stuff? How do we pit or evaluate players who are in more losing situations, a little bit lower in the standings, versus a team that, as the Suns are, is up at the very top of the standings? And so I think if you're crafting a case for Devin Booker to get any sort of MVP votes, let alone to think about him in any sort of way where he might be winning that award, would have to start with the overall success of the Suns, because they're the 1 seed. They're the best team in the NBA far and away, right? There really hasn't been anybody close. But Booker statistically is behind in almost any way that you slice it. I mean, you could say the degree of difficulty with what he does is more impressive. The two-way play, the way that he's able to balance that. Maybe you care that he plays a lot of minutes in a lot of games. I mean, there are obviously things that maybe set him apart, but he's not going to be the guy where you're going to say, well, statistically, his case is so much better than Giannis or Jokic or Embiid, who are the clear 3 front runners. But what do you make of that concept? Because 2 of those 3 guys are on teams that aren't, they're probably going to finish 4 to 6 between the Sixers and the Nuggets in their respective conferences.
That's not true anymore. The Sixers and Bucks are tied right now, actually.
That's fair. But
the point being is they're all 3 teams are well behind where the Suns.
Well behind the Suns, and the Sixers, haven't by no means been dominant the whole season, right? They've made a little bit of a push lately as some other teams have fallen down. They've been in that 1, 2, 3 range. It's not as if it's the same thing as the Suns or past Warriors seasons where Steph won it and they were at the top of the standings. Mm-hmm. They've kind of been neck and neck. The East has been right there with all of those top teams for most of the year. So yeah, what do you make of, how do you evaluate that? And what do you make of whether we should give some sort of preferential treatment in awards talk to these teams who just, flat out destroy teams? The Spurs of the past, they didn't have an MVP. They didn't really they're kind of in the same shoes. Should we have done that more? Like, what do you make of all of it?
Yeah. So I think the way I try to frame these things is, I'm cool if someone wants to make the case for why Booker or CP last year deserved to be higher up than where they finished. And obviously CP still finished top. He was 5th overall. Incredible accomplishment. That's a great season if you're 5th in the MVP voting. So like if you should explain like what exactly Booker or CP or maybe a Spurs player, how much they contribute to what that team does overall. And to me, like, I think Booker has a strong All-NBA case, whether it's second team, third team. Maybe you want to go first team if you really kind of feel strongly about his contributions. I think he has a case there, but it just falls short any more than that, because like, has he been a better offensive player than Jokic, Embiid, or Giannis? That's pretty tough to say. His scoring efficiency is not close to them. His passing, I think among any of them, he's probably closest to Embiid, and I think it's different types of passing too. Obviously he's behind Jokic. I think Giannis has been great there. Defensively, definitely not on Embiid or Giannis' level. Jokic has gotten better this year. Book's obviously gotten better as well defensively. I think he's done a great job, but it's really tough to craft a high level impact as a backcourt player. So I think he has a great case as an All-NBA guy, but it just falls short when you scrutinize him compared to the other guys. That's not to pick Book apart. He's been great this year, but you're talking about the cream of the crop, the highest level. You kind of got to nitpick a little bit, and so I don't think Booker quite gets there. And I think you'd have to really, really buy into his individual shot making and love his passing and team defense and strides as non-ball defender this year with his physicality and whatnot. And I just can't get there because I think the entire system of the Suns is responsible. And I think Booker benefits from the Suns system maybe more than those other three guys. I'm not saying that like he's
That's
just
a great point. No, I think you're right.
like they run such a movement heavy offense. They run him off of those pin downs. They have great spacing, a great roller for him. He gets to play along CP a lot of minutes as well. Obviously, Chris Paul's injured right now, but I think he's a beneficiary of the system more than those other three guys are. And again, I'm not trying to say he's like just some guy who's only good because of the system. I don't want that to ever be what I'm saying here, but I think he has some decision-making tendencies that are a little bit masked at times because they kind of scheme him into those open step backs, those open kind of pin down plays, or there's a lot of reads that are kind of priced into the system that he's supposed to know, maybe more than the impromptu ones that a guy like a Giannis or Jokic makes especially. And so that's where the MVP case falls short for me. But I totally get where he's coming from, and that's not for me to like say like, oh, he's wrong. Like players deserve to feel like they do, and I'm never going to tell them otherwise. I'll disagree, but I'm not going to say someone's wrong. So
well, let me put it this way too. Then how do you feel just like as a basketball fan, as somebody who follows this stuff, cares? I mean, it matters who wins MVP, right? Like if we are in this weird kind of new era where the regular season seems to be devalued by a lot of teams and players are not prioritizing availability first and foremost to be on the court for 82 games. If they have an injury, they might sit more than they would have in 1991 and everybody was trying to be a tough guy and whatever. How do you think, like, that'll be different? It will be a little bit odd to have. I mean, we all used to hold up like, okay, Moses Malone, it was that 1 year where they were like 500 and he won the MVP. And then it came up again with Russell Westbrook. Like, okay, this team's not great, but he won the MVP and we did that. If that's more common, what does that change about just like talking about basketball in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, the way I've kind of learned to view the regular season with some of these teams is I think, and I don't think you're wrong in saying they devalue. I think the way I would kind of add on to that is they devalue winning games because they're using the regular season as a bright breeding ground for like experimentation. I look at a team like the Bucks this year. I look at a team like the Jazz, or the Bucks last year, even this year. Yeah. The Jazz this year, even. I know the Jazz aren't necessarily like a team that everyone's using as a title contender, but they've kind of changed up some of their base scheme to kind of try and be better prepared for the playoffs. Even the Suns at times have, and they've had to. Maybe the Suns is a little bit more by necessity, somewhat because they want to be better prepared. But you're looking at like DeAndre Ayton getting more touches. Look at Mikal Bridges getting more touches on the ball. So I view it through that lens, and in that sense, I find it fascinating. I think it's really cool to see what these teams will try and do, and how can they balance. Like what's the line, right? When you're the Bucks last year and you have Giannis, or this year you have a Drew Holiday and a Chris Middleton, you can usually figure it out, right? As long as those guys are available, throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks, and you're probably still going to win 54 games, 53 games, regardless of how well that experimentation goes. When you're the Suns and you have a great coach and a bunch of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 guys that can contribute on a given night, you're probably going to be okay when you're led by two all-NBA caliber guards and a top 5, 6 MVP candidate, at least in terms of last to a CP. Book, I don't know exactly where it'd be, but top 10 at the worst. Let's say top 10 there, which again is a great season. I want to say otherwise. So that's how I view it, but I think it does raise an interesting point, like how, is there going to reach a line where like MVPs are a cool accomplishment, but maybe not the kind of the summation of this guy was the best player in a given year. And that's not always.
I think we're there. I think we're already there. I mean,
anyways, but last year people probably say Giannis was, and that's not to say that Jokic was bad, but like Giannis just had an incredible postseason, and that's kind of what matters more. And Jokic wasn't bad in the postseason. He struggled a little bit against the Suns, but so it's interesting. And the way Giannis played in the playoffs, they kind of worked on that in the regular season, and sometimes it came at the expense of regular season wins, but prepared him and the Bucks to close out in Game 6, where he scored 50 and was magnificent in that entire series.
Jackson, come on, you don't need to rehash the past. No, I think that's an interesting. It's an interesting point, and I think the fact that you also then add in the lurking, obvious sort of part of all of that, where it's like you have guys like Kevin Durant and Kawhi Leonard, whose availability has been really uncertain for a couple of seasons. But if you had asked in the second round last year who the two best players in the NBA were, you might have put those guys 1 and 2. It could have easily made a case, and they were nowhere to be found in the MVP conversation, really, as far as I can remember, because mostly their injuries had prevented them from being out there enough to really be in that conversation in a major way. So I get where Book is coming from. I understand it. I actually really like your kind of theory there of the ability, like the kind of shepherding of a regular season is a new form of value in the NBA, where it's like if you can be the reason that your team can still afford to focus on improvement because they can count on you to create wins anyway. I think that's actually maybe an interesting kind of context to think about that stuff going forward. And I agree, if we are thinking about it that way, I think one, Chris Paul is probably who you would sort of highlight the ability to do that with on the Suns. And then two, I definitely don't think Book really belongs in that conversation the same way some of these just everything great about the team kind of starts from them types of players. And Book is not that type of guy, not to mention his defense and everything else. So we could go on all day about that. We have already gone long on this segment. We got to hit Mikal Bridges and his defense, whether he belongs in some of these very same awards conversations. But first, guys, today's show brought to you by PrizePicks. Daily fantasy made easy from the NBA across all leagues. It's easy to use, and here is how it works. You just pick 2 to 5 players and an over-under on their projections, and you can win up to 10 times on any entry. It's just you versus the projections. No pool, no opponent, no head-to-head, no any of that. It's the players you pick and the over or the under. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. PrizePicks is safe and offers fast withdrawals, and they have an award-winning app on both the App Store and Google Play Store. So once again, as an example, let's say you are riding the hot hand. You really like Devin Booker and how he's been playing. I think we're going to get one more Chris Paul-less game, and you want to ride the over on points. And let's say on the Wolves, you think that D'Angelo Russell is just going to be so sad that he's not quite as close friends with Cat as Booker is, and he's going to play poorly. So you're going to go under on D'Angelo Russell's points, and that'll be your lineup. That's 2 guys. You lock it in, and you watch the money roll in. For a limited time, PrizePicks has an exclusive no-brainer offer for all Locked On listeners to get in on the action. You will get $50 free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point. Of course they will, but you must use the code NBA to write an exclusive Locked On only offer. Sign up today, promo code NBA, and when your player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point, you get that $50 free. PrizePicks, daily fantasy, made easy. As I mentioned at the top of the show, a pretty in-depth piece that Jackson and his colleagues over at Basketball News put together, Mark Schindler and Nikias Duncan, and overview of really like what is asked of players defensively, what kind of qualifies as value on defense in a season like this, and with the way the game is played today. We'll get to some of the bigger picture observations, Jackson, to close out the show and talk a little bit about the Suns defense and how ready it might be for the playoffs, because I think that's an interesting kind of subsection of all of this. But Mikal Bridges, first and foremost, is a guy that from the beginning of the year has been getting more attention than I expected as a defensive player of the year type of candidate. And the reason that I say that I didn't expect it isn't really much to do with him at all. It's mostly the limitations of what a wing can accomplish on defense, as well as the lack of history that those guys win that award. So how do you think about Mikal Bridges' defense relative to some of the big men? Let's just start there that might be in that DPOY finalist list come the end of the season. Like what can a wing do? What has he been able to do that makes him valuable? And what are the differences between a big man and a player like him?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think maybe even more to your point too, is like, we maybe didn't expect this from Mikal, not because of his play individually, because he didn't make a team last year. And like, I think, like, I don't know, you would know better than I was, but I don't feel like he's been astronomically better than he was last year. Like, to go from an not all defense guy to a DPOY is a pretty massive jump without some ridiculous, actual on-court improvements. The way I look at it with Mikal is what I think he is masterful at is deterrence, whether it's the peel switches on rollers, whether it's deterring a pocket pass, whether it's blowing up a handoff. He is great at those sort of things with his length. His hands are always active and high. I tweeted out a clip about Herb Jones today doing similar things, and people are like, Mikal Jr., it's the same thing with them. They're so good with their hands and their length, their timing of rotations. The issue, or maybe the limiter of that impact is if Mikal denies something, the offense can just kind of go somewhere else, right? And say, okay, we're going to, like, I think at times Mikal's almost had the shutdown corner effect where, like, I'll be watching a game and I'll be like, Mikal hasn't done much today. And then I'll maybe rewind a little bit and be like, oh, that's because they didn't even go to Mikal's side of the floor. And
the
so
Kawhi Leonard effect is a lot. He saw that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when in his 2 or 3 year prime or your peak in San Antonio on that end. So that'll happen. The issue can kind of compared to a guy like a Giannis or a Bam, or, an Embiid at this peak. Embiid isn't in the DPOY conversation this year, but kind of maybe in the playoffs, is a play kind of ends when you challenge those guys, right? Whether it's a block at the rim, whether it's forcing a miss at the rim and they grab a rebound, and then the possession's over. Whereas, like, there are times when Mikal deters or denies something, and then they'll go to the other side, and maybe it's like, okay, CP's empty in the corner there. We know CP's lateral movement is declined. Let's just throw a back cut in, and then boom, it's an easy bucket. So it's not Mikal's fault, but there's still 2 points on the board. And so maybe he made an impact and he played good defense, but the impact ended 5 seconds later. So that's not Mikal's fault so much. It's just the reality of things. And to his credit, he is pretty good I feel like as a weak side guy at the rim for his size, but he doesn't end so many plays defensively, which is where it gets really tough. So Nekias, Mark, and I talked for a while. We got on Zoom and talked about these things for a while, and we all agreed that Mikal was a first-team guy for us, I think, but we just couldn't quite get there. I know we had Marcus Smart on there as well. The difference for us is we think Smart's kind of communication and everything he does is really kind of the hallmark of, like, we think he kind of keys that, and we didn't necessarily kind of agree as much that Mikal, like, as much as he is really, really good on that, it didn't feel like he shepherds everything for them, whereas we feel like with Marcus Smart's ability to play in the post, play the nail, play on the ball, to switch, communicate, all that switching. Both the Suns and Celtics are super crisp with their switches. Those are probably the 2 best teams that come to mind for me. Maybe Miami, maybe Golden State with Draymond, but we just felt like that was the big difference for us, that Mikal is a really, really key and important cog in what the Suns do, but it's not quite to the degree of someone like Smart. The inverse is Mikal has also played every game. He's got a pretty nice leg up on some of these other candidates, whether it's a Giannis just as a maintenance, Rudy Gobert's missed some time, Bam missed time, Smart's missed, I think, 12 to 15 games with a couple of injuries. So there's a case for sure, but I don't know if on a per possession basis he's there, and so that's where kind of we fell short. But I totally get that if you want to reward him for being on the second ranked defense, the best perimeter defender, deterring all these things, teams just kind of shine away from him because he's so good, and the fact that he's played 2,700 minutes or whatever, has played every game, then I get it. But we just couldn't quite get there. But like I said, he was like a unanimous, really easy vote for us on first team. Yeah. And I mean, he's just been so incredible. I feel like every time I watch a Suns game, it's like, wait, why did, like, I'll have to rewind and be like, wait, why didn't that play work for the offense? And then it's like, oh, because Mikal said no to the handoff, then he switched it, and then he deterred the pocket pass, and then all of a sudden they got up a late clock 3 over a Jay Crowder contest, and that wasn't ideal. So he's been awesome this year, and absolutely should be at worst a second team guy, definitely a first team guy for me.
Yeah, for people who feel like the piece or Jackson's answer there was like negative, I get why you're reiterating that he's at the top. You also included the note, I mean, I don't know who wrote each section, but that he's been by and large the best wing defender in the NBA this season. And he, interestingly, is one of the only real wing, like a guy where you would just very clearly classify him as being a wing in the full 10 guys that you guys put together. I thought that was a little bit interesting. It was very guards and then bigs, and even
I think it was him and Herbert Jones, right?
Yeah, him and Herb Jones. And then, however I feel like Giannis is a big man, and Jaren Jackson, Evan Mobley, Bam Adebayo, those guys are, they're combo big men. They're really protecting the rim and rotating and being that help defense. And then, potentially in the case of Giannis and Bam and some other guys, they might have some standout moments, with their versatility to guard different types of perimeter players as well. But I thought that was a little bit interesting. And I was going to bring up the Marcus Smart part too, because part of what obviously piqued my curiosity is the case sort of against Mikal, which I think you made well, is he at his best is forcing the offense to maybe do something it wasn't planning on doing, but he's not stopping the offense from succeeding at the object of putting the ball into the basket as often, right? And that's value in a huge way. And obviously there's also the aspect of just sort of his matchups and the fact that he tends to draw incredibly high usage players, incredibly talented players of all shapes and sizes every single night. I think that's a big part of why Suns fans tend to feel like he doesn't get enough appreciation, is just the difficulty of his assignment every night, and the fact that he's kind of asked to do, it's not a different thing per se, because it's, hey, go defend that player, but what that player might do on the court is going to be pretty different, whether it's, Pascal Siakam versus Trae Young. It's going to be a whole different assortment of, game planning you need to do mentally, and reading and reacting to what they're that's just the space they occupy on the floor. All of that's going to be really different. But then Marcus Smart is a similar type of player, but I think you made the case well there as well. Like, he is in more different positions within their defense more consistently. He has the physicality that I think allows him to stop plays in their tracks to an even greater degree than Mikal, because obviously the one element that Mikal doesn't quite have, maybe just won't have, I don't know, is just that incredible strength that a guy like Smart or Drew Holiday is going to have for you. So I think those are all totally well received. I have never quite, as I kind of started this off by saying, bought into the idea that Mikal was really going to be a defensive player of the year guy for a lot of these reasons. And it's not a knock against him, really. It's more just how difficult it is, I think, to kind of make a huge impact defensively at his position, and just honestly overall in the NBA, with the amount of offensive sophistication for the best teams and how much individual talent there is in the league right now. But I think that lends itself to a broader conversation about the Suns defense. So we can take a quick break and get into that, guys. Today's show brought to you as well by Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar ever, and the solution to your New Year's resolution problems. If you're the type that likes to head into the new year making plans, we are already toward the end of March. I'm sure many of those have been scrapped, not the least of which might be eating better. And I get that. I totally get that. I actually just opened a jumbo chocolate bar while I was at work today, so you don't have to question me on that. I completely understand. But Built Bar can be actually a perfect solution for that exact problem, because they are effectively a candy bar. They just are packed with protein. They are filled with 15 to 20 grams of protein in each bar, but never really going to be more than 5 grams of sugar, never going to get more than 200 calories. So it's something light, something that's actually going to fuel your body more so than just the sugar and the carbs. And it is delicious, just like your normal candy bar would be. There's a flavor for everybody, whether that's strawberry, orange, raspberry on the fruit side, or something richer like double chocolate or salted caramel or mint brownie. My personal favorite, coconut almond. At Built Bar, they're all about taste. They make it delicious first, and then they figure out how to make it healthy, and they pull it off every single time. Go check them out, guys. Built.com. When you make your purchase, use the promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. Okay, Jackson, so I want to have a little bit of a bigger picture conversation about the Suns defense and just defense in general. That, I think we can agree, was one of their downfalls, was the sort of inability to contain what the Bucks were doing while also just matching up their individual defenders with the Bucks' individual scorers. But I was listening to you kind of talk about Marcus Smart and how you guys were thinking about Mikal, and I wonder if it's a little bit of the curse of, because it's the same thing that sort of came up with Booker. It feels like a little bit of a good coach penalty, and it's not to say Ime Udoka is not a good coach or anybody, Mike Budenholzer is not a good coach, but I think that is a very difficult thing to separate out from the Suns players' abilities. And I think that part of it, again, brings us to some of those Spurs teams where it's just very difficult to separate the sum of its parts from the individual pieces when you're evaluating them for something like an award. And Mikal seems to be, he's executing what he's asked to do to the highest degree. So I'm sure a lot of Suns fans are like, what the hell else is the guy supposed to do? But How do you think about the Suns defense overall and how it seems to have answers for everything? And I guess if there's anything you've seen differently from the Suns defense this season.
Yeah, so I think I kind of mentioned it earlier, but just generally speaking, they're switching most things, right? Not everything. They're trying. There's certain matchups and guys. They're not trying to have some of their lesser good defenders or maybe even negative defenders, be tasked with. But they're switching so many things. They're so crisp. Like you compare, like this is obviously very different ends of the spectrum. But just go watch the Suns Rockets game. The Rockets are switching a lot of things too. The times that were like the Rockets players don't realize that they're supposed to switch something versus the times the Suns are like already on top before like the action's already happened basically is really staggering there. So they're really good at that. I think Ayton's probably been on the year like better. He obviously kind of found his stride last year in the last 2 or 3 months or so. I don't remember exactly when it was, but kind of wouldn't say a flip was switched or a switch was flipped, but definitely took a big stride there. I feel like this year he's been pretty consistent all year. Still has some times where like he's maybe not as active as you'd want, but the mobility, especially in a straight line, kind of defending on the perimeter is really good. The active hands and pick and roll coverage has been really impressive this year, so that's important. As I talked about in the first segment, Booker's obviously taken some strides. Uses his physicality and size well, in the point of attack or when the guys try to kind of use their own strength against him. Has long, I felt, been a pretty good interior helper, especially as kind of a weak side defender for a 6'5" guard or whatever it is. Has really good verticality, uses his kind of core strength well to give guys issues. So Crowder is super good at the nail as well. You can just tell there are games where they miss Jay there, kind of mucking things up on drives and pick and rolls with his physicality and kind of his low man stuff with his size, or I guess I should say his strength. CP I still feel like is remarkably good at closing out somehow, despite like his lateral.
He's so good at it.
Like
yeah,
he has issues defending in space. I think back to that first Miami game that they lost. He had some issues in that game with Miami's bevy of off-ball shooters, but closing out, he's still masterful at that, which is really impressive. The hands are, I don't know if he still leads the league in steals. He's up there again this year. So those are two traits that are good.
May we all have old man hips like Chris Paul has. Honestly, if we can all just keep the hips intact until we're 40, that would be ideal.
Yeah, center of gravity with him is good as well. Obviously, he has issues when you kind of can get some speed and space, but Cam Payne, I feel like when he's been healthy, has been pretty solid again this year. Cam Johnson is good positionally. JaVale has some issues. Stretch fives are kind of his nemesis. But defending within 3 or 4 feet, he's still really good. Get that length and that bounce. I'm sure I'm missing some from guys in the rotation, but those are kind of the ones that really stand out to me that have been key. Obviously, again, there are issues. Kind of maybe they're not everyone's perfect, but it feels like there's a lot of continuity among their guys, and obviously the Mikal and the Ayton and maybe the Crowder you could call their 3 best defenders, but it feels like when those 1 or 2 of those guys are out, it doesn't feel like all of a sudden the ship is flooded, right? Like there's not a giant leak. Maybe the caliber of defense is down, but that also usually coincides with the other team not having its 5 best offensive weapons out there, or 5 most harmonic, guys out there. So that's what stands to me. There's just not a lot of, negative defenders in their rotation. I am curious to kind of see if there's an offense that can put CP in space and maybe exploit some of Booker's perimeter off-ball issues. He can kind of be a little spacey, but for the most part, I feel very good about them, and it does really feel like Ayton, just took a step forward last year in the playoffs, and then kind of carried over, same with Mikal to an extent. So I feel good about their defense, but those are just kind of 2 minor things if I'm nitpicking, right? But I'm pretty encouraged by them.
They have gotten a lot of credit. Probably on a national level, most notably when Zach Lowe wrote the breakdown during the second round series against the Nuggets of just some of their little tricks off the ball when they're running pick and roll, and how complicated some of their, simple offense can be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think defensively, because I feel like actually you, Jackson, were the guest last year that I would bring on most consistently and just ask you, can you please help us understand why the defense is good? Because I didn't understand it for like 60 games. And then, you watch it enough and it starts to make sense. But I think what after now 2 years of it is so key is they maybe have, the most, I think Zach Lowe called it the most sophisticated pick and roll offense in the NBA. I don't watch enough of every other team to make a claim like that, but I think they also have the most ready-made pick and roll defense in the NBA in a lot of ways as well. And I think that there's some things about that you might like to have a little bit better. Maybe, a four-man who was, as much as you appreciate Jay Crowder, and I agree with you on all the things, it's part of why I think we haven't seen Cam Johnson quite leapfrog him the way maybe Suns fans want at times in the rotation, is because of how much he brings defensively as a help guy, but especially, but also, just there's certain matchups where Jay is still the first answer for that stuff. You might want somebody bigger in that spot, right? You might want somebody a little bit more effective at the point of attack when your two options at the guard spots are Booker and Paul, neither of which is, elite at that way. And you kind of have to rearrange things because Bridges is the number one option there. And you have some weird cross matching that can, like there are, like you were saying, nitpicking in terms of matchups, in terms of styles, in terms of players. But at the same time, they rotate at another level. I don't see a lot of teams in the NBA that can fly around and communicate and just have a subconscious knowledge of where the other four players on their team are going to be defensively, like the Suns can do. And they have the ability to switch a lot of that stuff, like you were mentioning, in a way that even if size-wise it doesn't always seem like it's going to be perfect, I think it tends to pan out. And that is part of, I guess, some optimism. They just made a deep run. They were able to handle a lot of different types of offenses, but I think that also can be a little bit of maybe why you feel like, okay, is this a team that is susceptible to some bad matchups in the postseason, right? Like, is that sort of cohesion, IQ stuff a little bit more effective in the regular season than it might be in the playoffs, when some of those mismatched susceptibility problems can come into play and the size problems can come into play? Do you think that what we saw in the finals or at different times over the course of the past couple of years, when offenses have really caught fire against the Suns, do you think that that's some sort of structural flaw that Suns fans should have their eye on heading into the postseason? Or do you think of that more as something that, some teams are just going to catch them? There's maybe, squads here and there that really might have their number, but by and large, they are really ready for mostly anything that they'll see.
Yeah, I think that's definitely kind of a reasonable thing to just keep in mind, right? Not necessarily say it's a concern or a worry, but just something to keep in mind that, yeah, they are so cohesive, and sometimes that can carry you to levels that maybe you're not quite equipped to reach in the postseason as you do in the regular season. But I think where I don't worry too much about that is I'm trying to think of team, like, obviously I have to think more in depth, but like there aren't many teams that can both give the Suns defense big issues and also slow them offensively when you factor in the growth of Ayton this year, the growth of Mikal over the last 25, 30 games, whatever he's done from this prolonged stretch that seems very real and encouraging now. The growth of Cam this year, Booker, continuing to make just great reads and whatnot. So
we know the team that can do it. It's Milwaukee.
And I think I think Milwaukee deserves the benefit of the doubt, but its defense hasn't been to the level it was last year, and it's missed Brook for a lot. Some of that will ride on Brook getting back to where he was. You can see you kind of tune in some of their games recently. You can see how much they enjoy having Brook back over the last week or so. But yeah, that's really about the only term now, and maybe the Sixers really figure it out with that two-man game offensively and Joel doing everything defensively. Maybe the Heat can kind of do. But I'm not saying they're going to either one of those teams. But
was there anyone in the West? Do you think there's a team in the West? Because that's the place I often go. Is I get so caught up with the Eastern Conference, and it sounds so cocky. Like, well, when the Suns get to the finals, here's what they'll have to worry about, and it's like they're probably going to have to play some really good teams to get there. When you were talking about the team that would maybe be able to pose their defense some problems, one that I hadn't talked about lately, because the Mavs have changed so much, I think it would have been helpful for me to be able to see those teams play each other after the KP trade, which we won't be able to see. but I don't really feel like Dallas's defense is going to pose problems for the Suns in a huge way. I think the Suns offense should be able to be pretty effective. And then it just becomes sort of a who scores, 128 versus 122 or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Dallas's defense is quite good, but they feel like the sort of team where you're mentioning like just being cohesive can kind of get you so far. I just don't quite think they have the level of talent. They're a really good defense. They've been, I think, like top 3 or 4 dating back to like New Year's Eve. But they don't have that quite. I mean, their best wing stopper is Dorian Finney-Smith, who's having a great year, but he's not quite that all defensive level. Obviously, they're a little undersized in size with Dwight Powell, who's been awesome. But yeah, so I think that would be kind of a better team that would, than the Suns in terms of kind of maybe off like cohesion and just being on a string can get you so far. But yeah, I think the Warriors, I mean, you talk about teams that can kind of put Chris Paul in space off the ball. That's a team if they continue to run maybe some of these 3-guard lineups when Steph gets back, and obviously fingers crossed he does get back. With Jordan Poole and Klay Thompson and Steph, you're looking at a pretty tough off-ball trio. Like where do you hide a Chris Paul? Because then if they're going to still start Wiggins, and maybe it's talking about their death lineup, right, where they have Wiggins and then Draymond at the 5. Like if you try to put Chris on Wiggins, the Warriors have shown like you put a small guy on Wiggins, and Wiggins has struggled recently, but if he gets back to his all-star form, they're just going to post him up. They're on a bunch of flex screens and whatnot. So that would be the team that gives me the most worries in the West. In the East, obviously, I think it's the Bucks. The Bucks offense has like been an absolute buzzsaw for 5-6 weeks, maybe a month at a minimum. So just really good sets and 3 really high level offensive players with Drew, Chris, and Giannis. So those would be the 2 biggest teams that give me worry. I think Miami has kind of the off-ball shooting, but I don't think they have kind of the go-to scoring unless Jimmy kind of takes over. But Jimmy can be so fickle in kind of how he decides to attack offensively. So I think Miami maybe could give Chris Paul issues, but then the rest of Phoenix's defense would be fine. Especially at the point of attack, you can only do so much as an off-ball heavy offense, right? Someone's got to be creating on the ball to an extent. So
you need to become bubble Jimmy at the end of the day for your, and his jump shot's been cold and everything else.
And he's been great this year. But yeah, he just like I said, he sometimes he'll try to create to make something happen for someone else, and then it's like Jimmy, you just missed it. There was an open 4-footer that you didn't look at. Sure. So. I think it'd be Milwaukee and Golden State. But again, Golden State's in this weird spot where like they just got Draymond back, or they just got Klay, and then Draymond left, and they just got Draymond back, and now Steph's out. So you just kind of wonder like, are they gonna run out of time? It helps that those 3 have played together for so many years, and I don't think they're gonna run out of time, especially if Steph can come back. But sometimes just not your year. But that would be the team that I think, especially with the way Jordan Poole's been playing for the last 2 or 3 weeks and how good he is as an off-ball guy. You wonder like, where do you put Steph? And but again, that's also coinciding with Wiggins kind of falling back to earth. So who knows? But those would be the 2 teams for me: Milwaukee and Golden State.
We watched. Well, we haven't watched 82 games quite yet. We've watched 70 plus NBA games, Suns games, Jackson, and somehow your answer was probably exactly the same one that Suns fans would have given in November as to which teams worried them and how well equipped the Suns were to handle each of them. It's funny how that happens. I'm not saying we didn't learn anything or that the season was not worth playing, but it is exactly what we thought we were going to see. Injuries are going to play such a big part in the West, and we don't know exactly what form any of the Suns' potential opponents might take, but it is kind of funny where it's like, well, the Warriors and the Bucks, and if you can avoid playing either one of those, you're going to feel pretty good. And if you can beat them, I think that's probably going to be the difference between last year and a championship. So thank you for breaking all of that down. You can read Jackson's work at Dime, at Basketball News, as I mentioned previously. You can follow him at JackFrank_JJF, although he did just warn me he is rarely on Twitter, so it might behoove you to just check into the websites. Go old-fashioned, just browser.com, hit enter, read what the latest is. It's up to you, but that'll do it for us today, guys.
I'm throwing a couple of tweets out there today.
Okay.
Yeah,
you still get clips. You still get Mikal Bridges propaganda, I hope, on Jackson's timeline. That's been a mainstay. We have games the next 2 days, guys. That'll be how we wrap up the week here. Aaron Edwards will be joining us for his weekly visit after the Wolves game. So we'll talk about that matchup. Could be a first-round series, so we'll have a lot to talk about there. And then Thursday will be the I don't know who they're playing because I can't think of it right now, but that's how we'll wrap up the week. Thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen Now go make Locked On NBA your second listen to catch up on everything you missed around the NBA on Tuesday night.